Hi, I'm J.R. Daniels, and we are here at the Blessed Sacrament Chapel of Sacred Heart Church, and I'm here interviewing Jim Stork. Jim, so tell me a little bit about your background. You grew up in Clarion County,
Yes.
and what was your exposure to music and the organ?
Okay. Well, I'm not actually a native of Clarion County because I was actually born in Wilkinsburg.
Okay,
But my mother, who grew up in Turtle Creek, had a back operation in Columbia Hospital, which was then in Wilkinsburg. And her doctor wanted her to deliver in his hospital in case anything went wrong. So I was there for about a week, and then I went to Clarion County.
okay,
But anyway, to tell you the background on my family, my mother and dad grew up in the industrial suburbs of Pittsburgh, Turtle Creek and Wilmerding. My dad's father worked as a machinist in the Westinghouse air brake. My mother's father worked in the Westinghouse Electric Company, and actually he rose to be a foreman of the coil winding shop for a guy who had no education. It was quite well, and you could do that back in those days. So, anyway, they grew up there, and they actually went to the same high school, which was Union High School in Turtle Creek. But I don't think they started dating until after they got out of school. But at any rate, my dad was class of 24, my mother 26, and they got married in 1928. And my brother came along very quickly. Uh, we say up in the country, the first one always comes early. So at any rate, he came along very quickly, but I didn't come along until 11 years later, and there were no children in between. So, and then what happened was my mother and dad got married, and they were living, I think, in Wilmerding. My dad was working for the Internal Revenue Service in Pittsburgh. And one of his colleagues was what we used to call a spinster lady. She had never married. She was middle-aged, but she had grown up in Reimersburg, Pennsylvania, which is in Clarion County. And she would go visit her friends for the weekend because Pittsburgh was not a great place to be in the 1930s. So it was good to get out of town. So she came back one Monday morning. She came back and said, "Now, Bud," as he went by in those days, "Bud, the bank in Reimersburg is looking for a bright young guy who has some accounting knowledge." And so my dad went up and interviewed, and I have no idea how he got there. I don't think he had a car in those days. But at any rate, he got the job. So he was the assistant cashier of the First National Bank of Reimersburg for a little over 10 years. And then, as I said, I came along in 1939. In 1941, the First National Banks of New Bethlehem, Reimersburg, and Sligo were controlled by the same group of people. So they invited him to come over to New Bethlehem as assistant cashier and then to move up to cashier when the current cashier retired, which was going to be in another year or so. Now, in a national bank, the cashier is the chief operating officer. The title isn't used much anymore, but in those days it was a big deal. And furthermore, in a rural bank, usually the cashier is the chief lending officer. So he ran the bank. And so he was there for another whatever years. So I was 1 year old when I moved to New Bethlehem. I was there until I was a sophomore in college, and then my family moved out of town.
okay.
They went elsewhere. So that's my background with them. And
How did you get interested in music and
then the
organ?
music. Um, my mother was a pretty decent contralto soloist. No real training, but she was pretty good, and she read very well. And so as soon as my voice changed, I was conscripted into the church choir. This was the First Baptist Church in New Bethlehem. And actually it was a nice little choir. We had, I think, with me, 3 basses, we had 2 tenors, and the rest of them were women, and we could only seat 12. It was that. But we had a 214 Felgemacher. organ.
Mhm.
Wonderful, wonderful instrument. So I fell in love with the organ at that point. Now, as far as music goes, I started taking piano when I was 6 years old. I hated my teacher and I got out of it in a year, and I regret it ever since.
Okay.
But nonetheless, she taught me a lot of music. But then as time went on, then when I was a junior and senior in high school, I studied voice with a local retired guy who had actually had a career in Cleveland. He sang, he was a cantor for one of the big Reformed synagogues and one of the Reformed temples. And he sang with the Cleveland Opera and et cetera, et cetera. So, and then when I went to Bucknell, I studied voice. I took voice lessons for another 2 years.
Okay.
And with a fellow by the name of Jack Prim. And Jack was also the director of the Glee Club, the men's Glee Club, and I sang with them.
Oh, great.
So
Okay.
that was that. And as a voice student, of course, I got to do a little solo theaters here and there in various churches. So one time, actually, I think I had laryngitis, and I was singing with the head of the music department, who's playing the organ, and I got through it. So, but anyway, that was my background in music. And then, but what happened was the organ is the accompanimental instrument for the church, for church choirs. So I got interested in the organ, and actually, when I got finally dropped out of graduate school, um, I did a lot of reading on it. Bill Barnes' book, and E.M. Skinner wrote some stuff, and Hans, and all sorts of other people. So I learned a lot about organ building.
So now you ended up coming to Pittsburgh as a banker.
No, I came to Pittsburgh. Well, it's interesting, as it says on there, I have both a bachelor's and a master's in physics from Bucknell, and then I have an MBA, which is from Pitt. What happened was I screwed up very badly in my freshman year in college, and then things improved. But by the time I started applying to graduate schools, I could get into the major physics departments, but not with any money.
Okay.
And one needs money.
Yeah.
And so Bucknell invited me to stay on for a master's with an assistantship.
Okay.
And then after that, I applied to Pitt, and they took me with an assistantship, actually a bit of a raise. But 1 year later, I was so burned out that I couldn't do it anymore. So I went off and got a job for 4 years, actually in a laboratory, spectroscopy laboratory. And then I went back and got an MBA, and I went into banking.
Okay.
Why not? It's all the same thing.
Okay. Then it's a while ago now, but fairly at some point, fairly early in your life, you got interested in the new organ that was going to be put in Pleasant Hills.
Yes. Well, actually, I'll go back just a step. I came to Pittsburgh in 1963. At that time, the music hall organ was still playable.
Right.
The Beckerod at St. Paul had gone in the year before.
Right.
And the Larry Phelps Cass event over across the street here went in 63.
Right.
So, and these are free recitals. I'm a graduate student, so I'm going to free recitals. So I fell in love with all three organs. But then what happened was, I said, I'd read a lot about it. I knew a lot about it. I joined Pleasant Hills Community Presbyterian Church in 1964, and it turns out my first day in the church was also the first day of the new music director, whose name was Bob Fraser.
Right.
And Bob and I sang in his choir, and Bob and I became pretty good friends, and we'd talk about organs. Now, he was not an organist per se, because he was really a vocal guy. In fact, he'd sung with the Westminster Choir when he was at the choir college, and they sang with New York Philharmonic. And then when he was in Chicago, he sang with Margaret Hillis and the Chicago Symphony Chorus. So his field was really vocal music, but I don't think I ever heard him miss a note. He was just that kind of guy. And he could transpose at sight.
Oh, wow.
He was just this incredible musician. So we started, and though I'm all of 27 years old, he got me appointed as the chair of the organ committee. Now, what I told my committee was, we're not going to talk to any salesmen. We are just going to go out and listen to organs.
Good idea. Okay.
And we did that. And now I had like a 9-member committee. Not all of them participated every time, but I remember there were only 3 of us. But the one day we went to Jamestown, New York, to hear an Aeolian Skinner, and it was a Joe Whiteford Aeolian Skinner. It screamed bloody murder. And then we went to Bradford to listen to the largest Allen that had ever been built.
Okay.
All right, so we had to have to get the electronics in there. And then we went to Ward, the most lovely Holt camp you've ever heard. Just, it's a small 3-manual, just absolutely marvelous. And this was Walter Sr.
Okay.
He still could hear in those days.
Okay.
Yeah, he got a little hard of hearing. And anyway, so that was what we did. And then finally, after about a year, we had actually invited people to come in. I'm not sure. John Gillette from Aeolian Skinner, he was in the church only one time, and he and I had lunch together that day, and I don't think the committee was there. Also, Bob Fisher, who's local, was selling for Schlicker at the time.
Right.
He took us around to hear some things. And then, but the thing is, we knew, as I always say, we knew that God intended us to have a 3-manual organ.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have to go back and tell you what we had. When they built the sanctuary building in 1950, they got a previously owned Midmer 25 rank 3-manual that had come out of the First Lutheran Church of Altoona.
Okay.
And it was replaced with an Aeolian Skinner, but it was a Don Harrison Aeolian Skinner. At any rate, that got, and the architect hadn't left enough space for even a 2-manual organ. So the grate and swell, and there was very little pedal, got jammed in the side chambers, and you couldn't even get in. It was impossible to maintain this thing. And the choir went in the attic. Now you can imagine it was never in tune. So we really had a small 2-manual with a 3-manual Moeller console. Absolutely beautiful console. But that was the what we had. Now, coming back to the committee, we knew we wanted a 3-manual. We had no idea where we were going to put it. And Chick Holtkamp walks in the church, looks around, and the church is dead as a doornail. I mean, it's a terrible acoustic. Looks around, he said, I would like to build you a 2-manual organ. And we thought, that's crazy. But we listened to him, and it is now 55 years old. It is a 230. It's a fat 2-manual. A 230 right smack in the middle of the chancel, speaks right down the axis of the church, and you can stand in the balcony and sing hymns. The organ has really held up very well. So Chick was very good at what he did. So that was the experience with that committee. And but I'll have to tell you the rest of that story. Now, we were the advisory committee. This had to go to the board of trustees.
Okay.
And they made the final decision. And I wrote this report, glowing report, and it went to the trustees, and they just rubber stamped it. And I went, man, I'm really good. Well, it turns out that the president of the board of trustees, his wife had gone to Mills College in Oakland, California, and Chick Holtkamp had just finished an organ for Mills College. So what was good for Mills College was good for Pleasant Hills. So at any rate, but it was a a lot of fun.
Now, just a quick aside, and then I want to ask you some other things, but you did serve as treasurer for the OHS.
Yes.
For how long?
Um, Actually, for 3 years, maybe a little more than 3 years, I have to step back on that because what happened, well, um, in, I believe it's 1999, as I recall, um, they started an endowment fund, and Pat Murphy
Mhm.
was very much involved in this.
Right.
And but it was to be overseen by a board, a 3-member board. All right, and what had happened that Skip Worshing, Charles P. Worshing Jr., um, who we were talking earlier, had he and his father had provided a lot of information for our archives on the Worshing Organ
Right.
Company. He was a very successful broker in Chicago, and so he was asked to be on that board. But he had a non-compete contract with his former. He was retired, but the firm Payne Weber that he worked for, he had a non-compete with them. And we had met at the archive earlier, and he knew I was in the money management business, and so he recommended me. So on the street corner in Chicago, Pat accosts me and say, "Would you like to serve on the endowment advisory board?" And I said, "Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I'll do that." Well, I became the spokesman for the advisory board, so I was meeting with National Council regularly, and our other two members, incidentally, were Dick Walker, who was from Charleston, and we
Right.
talked about him a little earlier. Dick was a weekend organist, but he sold Caterpillar tractors during the week.
Okay.
His father had started the firm. And the other one was James Johnston, who came from Corpus Christi, and he was a retired banker. At any rate, those were the three of us. But I regularly met with National Council. Well, then about, I think it was about 2006, um, Jack Bethards was then counselor for organizational concerns or whatever they called him. But he was concerned because we were losing money
Mhm.
with gay abandon. And the problem was that David Barnett, who was the treasurer, took care of the daily stuff, take in the money, pay the bills, and all that. And but he wasn't very good at communicating with the board, and he wasn't very good at budgeting. So I got offered the treasurer job,
Mm.
and I said, I will be glad to do it if David stays on as the controller, because I don't want to do that regular stuff.
Okay.
And so I got in charge of the budgets. Well, you don't make a lot of friends when you do the budget, but I did it for 3 years, and we turned it around. We brought it into the plus column. We were making money. We controlled our spending. And the other problem, and the problem we had at that time was that um, Bill Van Pelt, who had been the executive secretary or whatever we called him those days, um, had started an online uh, CD store,
Right.
uh, but concentrating just on organ CDs. But it began to lose money, and that was our cushion
Okay.
because at one time we were making like $300,000 a year out of that.
Yeah, I bought many CDs
Yeah, and you probably contributed. So that was starting to dwindle, and I ended up having to make a management change there so that we brought that back, and we were at least breaking even and making a little bit of money. So we pulled it through. Then basically people decided to change what we were doing, and it was an unfortunate period, but my life became pretty miserable, and I resigned.
Now, when did you first join the OHS?
Oh, the ocean. Well, I'll have to tell that story because I think it's interesting. I got interested in it because in the 1990s, I was working at Center City, Philadelphia, and I'd wander out at lunchtime sometimes. And there was an HMV record store, if you remember the record stores,
Okay. Yeah.
up on Walnut Street. And I wandered in one day, and I'm looking through the stuff, and here is a 3-disc set entitled "Historic Organs of Baltimore." I thought, that's interesting. I'll buy it. And I bought it. And then I looked at the package and, oh, Oregon Historical Society. So then I got interested.
Mhm.
And actually, I retired not too long after that. And actually, my first convention was Montreal in '99.
Oh, okay. I was at
A
that.
lot of
Mm,
Beckerats.
And when was it that we actually met? Do
I
you
don't
remember?
know.
Because I remember I got a phone call from you out of the blue, and I thought, "Who the hell's Jim Stark?" And you said, "I think we need to meet each other,
Yeah,
and we need to
probably.
talk about an OHS convention in Pittsburgh."
Yeah, probably about the same time I called Joe Zamberlin. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's about 20 years ago.
yeah, okay.
I called Joe the same way. A cold call. Hey Joe, I want to come out and see your shop.
Uh, Now, in um, 1990, Barbara Owen consulted as a potential restoration
Yes.
consultant for the Carnegie Music Hall organ. Dan, did you have anything to do with that?
The answer is no, I did not. This was 1990, before my time of being involved in the OHS, and uh, I was involved in music in Pittsburgh, but vocal music with the Bach Choir. But I was not involved in that. And what happened was the last, almost 4,000 recitals regularly scheduled
Right.
Sunday, and originally also Thursday recitals were played on that organ. The last recital was in May of 1981.
Mhm.
And actually, uh, most people won't recognize it, but you will. Bill Lindbergh played the last recital.
Okay.
At any rate, that was 81. Now, and then the organ just went silent. And so by 1990, the Board of Trustees is trying to figure out what they should do with it. And they contacted Jack Bethard. Jack, I have a copy of the letter, wrote him about a 4-page letter saying he would need 3 to 5 days at $75 an hour plus expenses. They obviously turned that down.
Mhm.
Barbara Owen said she could come in for an afternoon for $350, and she did. I cannot find what she recommended. I don't seem to have a copy of that. But the important thing is on spec, Nelson Barden did a complete proposal.
Okay. Do you know when that was roughly?
It was 1990.
Oh, 19.
It was the same time.
Okay. Now that must have been when Paul Koch was kind of overseeing things, I think, because
Yes, Paul was then had become the municipal organ.
right. And Paul had told me at that point, or shortly after, that he had actually secured a donor, or almost had a donor in place, and it was the gentleman that was the CEO of um, GNC
Oh, really? Oh, yeah.
products, and I guess the guy was ready to come forward to pay for the organ,
Yeah.
and then something happened and it didn't.
Well, I've heard the same story, but from oh God, the guy who he was a good OHS member. He became the Moeller representative, and I can't think of his name. But at any rate, I'd heard the same thing from him, that he had a donor lined up, and it could have been the same one. But the Carnegie only wanted the name so they could approach it, because they really didn't want to spend money on the organ.
Okay.
And so that was the problem. But as I said, but Nelson, and it's a very, very good proposal. He went through everything in the organ, and he estimated 1,600,000. This is 1990, so it's a little more today. Um, but he said it might go higher depending on what we find. But the trustees really didn't want to get involved in that. And so they blew off at least one contributor. And unfortunately, the auditorium has just gone through $1 million renovation, and that means they'll never touch the organ.
Right. Right.
It's probably gone. It's probably Skinner's best organ.
I agree with you.
But it's also jammed in.
True.
And the problem is, I don't know if you know the history, but Skinner rebuilt it, completely rebuilt it in 1933. But then in 1950, H.J. Heinz got rid of their Skinner theater organ. The pipes were just distributed off. But it had like 8 or 10 percussions, and they were given to the Carnegie. And Aeolian and Skinner installed them.
Okay.
But that jammed it up even worse. So, and of course, Don Harrison made a few small tweaks.
Now, at some point, you became interested in Philip Worshing.
Yeah.
And how did that come about? And can you tell me a little bit about?
What happened was when I retired, I was looking for something to do, and I was interested in the organ. So I thought organ history, and by that time, I was just about to join the OHS. And I thought, well, Andrew Carnegie was interesting. He gave money for something like 8,000 organs. And so I got the records from the Carnegie Corporation, which their archives are at Columbia University. And I started chasing down organs in Pittsburgh, and just to see what happened to them. After a while, it was not very interesting. Some were there and some were. Most were older. But
now I think he only gave actually a few organs, and then the bulk of them he would match.
Yeah. What happened?
Half of them.
What happened was the first organ was actually 1881. It was his mother's church, the Church of the New Jerusalem, which was on the north side in those days. But at any rate, that was the first one, and then he got more and more requests as time went on. In 1903, he decided, I'm just going to do matching grants. And you send me some financial information, and I'll decide how much to offer you.
Yeah. Now, 1903, I believe, was the last organ that he gave. I believe was St. Paul's Cathedral. He gave the Kimball in 1903. I believe he paid for the whole thing.
Actually, the Kimball was never built.
Yeah, it was in the cathedral downtown.
That one was moved.
Right, moved to the new cathedral in 1906.
Yeah.
Right, but he gave that.
Oh, he gave that, yes.
Right.
I can't find the actual, but I'm pretty sure he gave that.
Right.
That was the old cathedral.
Right.
Yeah, that was the Kimball. Well, what happened then, it turned out, and I had already been involved in it a little bit because I was involved a bit with singing at First Unitarian.
Right.
And I got involved in the organ there.
And they have a Worshing.
It turns out that 20 of the original 21 ranks of pipes are Worshing. The chests and the console are not.
Okay.
So that's the problem. But I got interested, and then I started running it down. And but then I realized that the archives have enormous amount of information on Worshing. So I could do a lot of stuff. And I ended up I wrote an article on that organ, but then I also wrote for the Tracker an article on the Art Organ Company, which was George Audsley's company.
Right.
He decided, now I speculate that he first went to Fleming, who he had worked with on the organ for the fair in Chicago. At any rate, and I think got turned down. They decided, in fact, this was the Art Organ Company, the Los Angeles Art Organ Company. They decided, and they formed Electronian in Hoboken. They decided to go into the resonance organ business on their own without Owsley. Then Owsley went to Worshing.
Okay.
And the organs they never really could compete with Aeolian. They just did. They didn't have the player. That was the problem. Aeolian had devised, it's a 116 note player, which we have at Hartwood, and that can play two manuals at once and a little bit of pedal.
Okay.
And that was patented, and nobody could infringe on it. In fact, they sued Los Angeles Art Organ Company at one time for patent infringement. So at any rate, that it ended up that I did a lot of work on Worshing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we managed to have two of them in Pittsburgh, but the 1950, the one you played at Verona, that one's very original.
Yeah, that's a lovely instrument.
Oh,
I remember I really enjoyed playing that.
And that was his typical small organ. It's only about 10 ranks. And the great, the 4-foot is a Gem's horn. And then you have a diapason on the swell, which is 2 pipes smaller than the 8-foot on the great. So when it's coupled at 4 foot, you get this. It really blooms.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful, wonderful instrument.
Now, you mentioned the Hartwood Acres. Can you tell
Hartwood.
about Hartwood and how that came about? And
Hartwood came about because we were preparing for the convention.
Right.
And
that was an Aeolian resonance organ.
Yeah.
Right.
It was.
That was not original to that mansion.
Well,
right.
What happened was, it was original to the William Flynn home on Highland Avenue, at Highland, and right by the park.
Right.
And it was actually a present for his daughter, Mary, when she graduated from college. She went to Briarcliff in New York. And so it was originally installed in that house. Now she could play. And so it was installed in that house, Braemar, I think they called it. And then when she built, and she and her husband, John Lawrence, built the house at Hartwood in 1928, 29, she had the organ moved there, and the architect designed the space so that it was exactly the same configuration as it was at Braemar.
Okay.
But it was in the basement.
Okay.
And it's the wettest basement you can ever imagine. So there was an enormous amount of damage done to it. And when we first went in, this was before the convention, we thought, man, it'd be nice to get this thing playing. We went in, it was John Calkins and I've forgotten somebody else. The blower would only stay on for 1 minute. It would overheat because there were so many leaks.
Okay.
And then we realized that you could not re-leather the reservoir in place. You had to tear down the whole organ. So we took it on, and I convinced the county to put, and as it ended up, $55,000 into this.
Mm-hmm.
And we hired some people, and we did there was a lot of volunteer labor, but it took probably 10 years.
Right.
And it's still, the harp will never play. Mm-hmm. It was in the wettest part of the basement. And there's still problems with it, but they are still using it for tours. And Lully, I got them in touch with Joe Tuttle at Lully, and they're now taking over tuning it.
Okay, so at least it's being maintained.
So it's being maintained.
Mm-hmm. Now let me ask you this: you had given a couple of lectures on Worshing and the oldest organ west of the Alleghenies. You at one point you had said you consider yourself a Baccarat Holtkamp man. What do you mean by that?
Well, I actually fell in love with Baccarat when I came to Pittsburgh in
Me too. Yeah.
'63. Yeah. Um, but but the whole camp's approach to organ building is very similar. Uh, Both of them basically build organs with tiered pitch divisions. Work principle.
Right. Right. So each division is
As
right.
we made up a phrase, and at any rate, and the background of St. Paul, it's very interesting. It's very straightforward. It's got a 32-foot pedal, a
16-foot
a
grade,
16-foot grade, an
yeah,
8-foot positive,
post deep right in and then
and a 4-foot solo,
right. Exactly.
and then an 8-foot swell.
Right.
And so it can play almost anything.
It can. I'm surprised how well that instrument plays French music.
Yeah. I'm always surprised at it. I'm French romantic on that instrument, just absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, I
Now,
just did I just did a recital 2 weeks ago, and I played a piece by Theodore Salome, and it just was glorious on that.
so what Walter Holtkamp Sr. did
Mhm.
on his 3 manuals, in fact, this goes back into the 30s, he would build an 8-foot grate, 16-foot pedal, 8-foot grate, and then a 4-foot positive, and then add an 8-foot swell
Mhm.
enclosed.
Okay.
Now, and I always say his 2 manual organs were very confusing because it was a Flintrop Brustwerk under expression
Mhm.
was the swell. What Fick did was to build a pretty straightforward 4-foot swell,
Mhm.
and he used in Pleasant Hills, he used and which was a 2 manual. He used a Spitzflöte for the 4-foot on the swell. So it's kind of in between. It can go with the strings, and it can go with the diapasons. And then he added a string, a gamba, and a celeste.
Mhm.
And so then when you draw those, you've got an 8-foot swell that can do pretty good job with romantic music.
Mhm.
But if you keep those out, then you've got the Verkprinzip tiered divisions.
Right.
So Chick used that a lot, and he was very fond of the 2 manual.
Right.
He
Do you
really,
think they were both influenced a lot by Baccarat?
oh yes, and what happened was that story has been around a long time. That when Baccarat did was it Trinity Lutheran in Cleveland?
Right.
This was '57. Holtkamp, Holtkamp had the good grace to marry a rich woman. Business was not, he didn't struggle. He didn't struggle. So he could take his time to do things. And he would invite Beckeras for picnics.
Mhm.
They drink beer and eat hot dogs and argue about organs. But Chick was sitting there
Listening.
at the knee
Yeah.
of both of them. And I think that's why Chick's organs, I think, did very well. And he built in a lot of different styles. Now, Mills College is even small, is only about 15 ranks, and it's all unenclosed,
Okay.
but it's still a very expensive structure.
Right.
And Jack Bethards takes care of the organ, and he said, I build romantic organs, but that is a little gem.
Mhm.
I always liked that.
Great.
So anyway, well, that's now.
So, anything else you'd like to tell us?
What else was on the list here?
Well, there's a lot of things that we didn't talk about, but I think you gave us pretty much all we were looking for.
Oh yes. Oh well, I will say about the OHS. Um, when I sort of wound up my part in it, basically, well, I probably resigned as treasurer sometime around the convention. I think by the time we got to the convention, I had already
Right.
resigned
Yeah.
from being treasurer. What happened was, um, for some strange reason, the powers that be decided that any gain in the endowment fund could be considered income and withdrawn. Now, the problem with managing endowment funds is you have to provide for the future.
Right.
Because next year the principal will be worth less than it was this year, even if it's the same quote, same amount of money. So you always have to, and the original bylaws for our endowment fund, we had to reinvest a third of the income. And I think that went by the way. So any gain, and this was a period we're talking about after 2009. Remember the stock market went through a big decline. That was anyway, it was a big decline in the stock market. And when it came back in 2010, it just kept on going. And every gain they spent. And some of us had some really serious arguments with them. And I got accused of all sorts of things, being nasty and asking gotcha questions, and I mean all that stuff. But now I don't really know. Since then, I have very frankly mostly ignored it. I'm still a member, but and we've worked on the organ here, and I love the archives. You guys do a good job, and so I've done some things, and actually, Ron Smith just got a copy of my article on Dietz Methodists in Omaha, for which I have said I've just got another begging letter. But anyway, but that's the important thing. That was the biggest change, and then after that, I was not involved in the internal part of it, so I have no idea what happened. Um, we got Stoneleigh, and we got a lot of funding from somewhere, and it's fine. And things are going well, apparently.
Now, how about, do you remember, did we have, I don't remember any big glitches or problems with the 2010 convention. Any comments from that?
Any what?
Any comments from the 2010 convention?
My favorite was Uwe Papa. Do you remember Uwe Papa? Uwe Papa was a very prominent German publisher on organs. And actually, Washington was the last convention he attended.
Okay.
But I remember, and he had a wonderful German accent. But we were walking out of a church in Washington together a year after our convention. And he said, in Pittsburgh, you had better organs and better organists. Now, that's the biggest compliment I think anybody could ever give you. But there was also, I don't know if you remember it, there was a review in the Diapason of the convention, and it was very complimentary. But the one I remember was, George Bozeman at Pleasant Hills.
Oh, yeah, right.
George played Ethelbert Nevin's A Day in Venice.
Right.
I mean, it was a transcription he did himself.
Yeah, but it was very good.
It was very good.
Yeah.
And the reviewer in the Diapason said, "Who knew that a whole camp could play theater music?"